Hello and welcome to this short video on using the Climate Bonds Initiative sector criteria. Alongside the Climate Bonds Standard, the Climate Bonds sector criteria will allow you to determine whether the assets or use of proceeds of a given debt issuance can be given limited or reasonable assurance for certification. This is an overview of the certification process, and in this video we're going to focus on the first part here and help you identify assets and uses of proceeds that meet the relevant sector criteria. Now, there are different approaches to determine whether assets or uses of proceeds will qualify for certification. One approach is to use the services of an underwriter, for example, an investment bank. Another approach would be to use the services of a verifier, and that would be a verifier approved by the Climate Bonds Initiative. A third approach is to use the services of a consultant, for example, a technical expert or an engineering company, and so on. Now, please keep in mind that we're talking about determining the eligibility of assets or use of proceeds for certification. This isn't the verification work itself. The actual assurance report can only be completed by a verifier that is approved by the Climate Bonds Initiative. However, this first step of simply determining the eligibility of assets or use of proceeds, that can be done by any of these three options, as well by someone in-house at your own company if you have the skills and resources to do so. Here are some random examples of verifiers approved by the Climate Bonds Initiative. Now, let's look at a high-level overview of the steps you would take in order to identify assets and uses of proceeds that are likely to meet the relevant sector criteria. In other words, assets and uses of proceeds that a verifier will be likely to issue limited or reasonable assurance against, confirming that they conform with the Climate Bond Standard and the associated Climate Bond sector criteria. The first step is to check the current Climate Bond sector criteria. Let's look at an example. To find the current Climate Bonds Initiative sector criteria, go to the website climatebonds.net, which is here, and then hover over to here where it reads Standard, and then go down to Sector Criteria, and then go right to where it reads Sector Criteria Available for Certification. And here you can see a list of the criteria that's available for certification. Let's go to the agriculture criteria as an example. When you land on one of the criteria pages, you'll notice on the left-hand side, you still have an overview of all of the other types of sector criteria that are available for certification. What this means is that a debt issuance's assets or uses of proceeds must fit into one or several of these categories here and conform with not only the Climate Bonds Standard, but also the sector criteria requirements of these here. Now, if, for example, there were a debt issuance and there were some wind farms and some agriculture projects, in that case, you would have to check the eligibility of the assets or use of proceeds against the wind energy criteria here and against the agriculture criteria here. Let's go a bit more in depth now into the agriculture criteria. One thing to keep in mind is that the web pages for the sector criteria all follow the same format. And what that means is that what you see here for the agriculture criteria on this page, and specifically what you see here under resources, these documents here, this is the entire universe of documentation that is relevant to certification under the Climate Bond Standard. In other words, there's no curtain of information behind which there's additional information. You have access to the same information that we have access to. Now, the main documents for any of the sector criteria are a criteria document, and that's different from the brochure. So first is the criteria document, and that's the main document for any given sector, the criteria document. And secondly is the background paper. If you can't find the answer you need in the criteria document, and most of the time the answer will be here in the criteria document, then check the background paper for additional information or guidance. So, now that we've identified the two core documents for most of the sector criteria, and again the main document always being the criteria document, let's take a look at a criteria document. Here we have the PDF for the agriculture criteria. So in this document here, for assets or uses of proceeds related to agriculture, this is the place you'll most likely find the answer as to whether something is eligible or not. Now, the sector criteria documents all take more or less the same form. And what's relevant usually at the beginning is this table here, which lists eligible activity types and examples of use of proceeds. And you can see here different categories and examples of uses of proceeds for each category. This list is not exhaustive. In other words, if the specific asset or activity is not listed here, it does not mean that that asset or use of proceed or activity is not certifiable. However, if that's the case, that would be a case where you would open the background paper, which you can find here, to read up on your specific asset or use of proceeds. So, going back to the criteria document for agriculture, you'll notice on the right hand here, there are mitigation criteria as well as adaptation and resilience criteria. Now, not all of the sector criteria have both mitigation and adaptation and resilience criteria. Some only have mitigation criteria. If the sector criteria only has mitigation criteria, then eligibility is determined solely on the basis of the mitigation criteria. If, however, there's also adaptation and resilience criteria, as you can see here, in that case, the asset or use of proceeds has to qualify with the criteria of both of these categories, mitigation and adaptation and resilience. Just to give an example, if you were looking at determining the eligibility of a debt issuance related to crops and a whole production unit, and the use of proceeds was for land acquisition and or conversion costs, in that case, it would need to meet the criteria of both the mitigation and adaptation and resilience categories. Now, once you've determined the sets of criteria that you have to meet, then you want to go to the specific section where you can find more details. In this case, it's section 3.2.1. Let's go take a look. So here in the same document is section 3.2.1, and notice that this is specifically for the criteria of the mitigation category, the mitigation component. And here is all the criteria here. There are also links to help you navigate the document. Because we saw that there was mitigation and adaptation and resilience components, here you can see is the second requirement for the adaptation and resilience component. And it's directing us to Appendix 1. So let's go take a look at that. And here we are again in the same document, Appendix 1, and this is the adaptation and resilience checklist for the whole agricultural production unit. And here is the criteria to meet the adaptation and resilience requirements for this specific asset or use of proceeds. And here's the criteria here. Fortunately, you don't have to read the entire criteria document, let alone the entire background paper, in most cases to determine whether a given asset or use of proceeds will most likely qualify for certification under the Climate Bond Standard. There are two tools that will help you quickly navigate the documentation to find the information you need. The first tool we recommend is the word search. This works on Mac computers as well as PCs. If you're in the document, that is the PDF, with the sector criteria, simply press Command on the keyboard and hold down the letter F. If you're using a PC, press Control and then hold down the letter F. Let's look at an example. So here in the sector criteria document, if we press Command and F on a Mac computer to summon the word search function, you can see that a little window opens up here, and then we can type in the word we're looking for. Let's say we're looking for non-perennial, and we can see that there are two entries of this word. One here and one here. And what this means is that we can anchor our reading around these two entries and then go from there. What this can do, besides diminishing the amount of time we spend reading the document, it can also give us valuable information up front. If we look up non-perennial, we can see that it is included in the document, which is a good sign. And secondly, here we can see that it is considered within scope, perennial and non-perennial crop production. So what it means is there's good reason to continue reading in certain areas of the document to find out the specifics of the criteria for, in this case, non-perennial crop production. A second tool that can be very useful in helping you navigate the documents is the snapshot tool. This is especially useful if you have specific questions about a part of the criteria document and you want to potentially circulate those questions via email to someone in your company or with another company or with us in the Climate Bond Certification team. Just as with the word search, if you're using a Mac computer, press on your keyboard Shift, End, Command, and number 4. hold them down all at the same time. For a PC, you'll use the snipping tool, which you can find in your search bar. So for example, if we're back in the criteria document, and let's say you have a question about this specific part here, you can simply take a snapshot like this, the snapshot will then appear like this, and then you'll have the option of marking it up as well. Here, for example, is the snapshot we just took. And once you have it here, you can mark it up to bring the attention to a specific part of it. For example, maybe here, and maybe here your question was about forest inventory surveys. And then you can save that by clicking Done, and then you can copy that image and put it in an email. So again, these are the two tools we recommend you use: word search to find out specifically what you want to know to determine eligibility, and the snapshot tool, which is especially useful for questions, taking parts of documents that you can then send to the verifier that you've hired, or the investment bank, or the technical expert, or whoever is helping you determine the eligibility of your assets or use of proceeds. The next step to determine eligibility is to check the current climate bond standard. To find the current climate bond standard, again, go to climatebonds.net, hover over where it reads certification, and then go down to the standard with the highest number. In this case, version 3.0, that's the current one. If you click on it, it takes you to a page where you can then see the latest version of the climate bond standard. This is the go-to resource for understanding the certification process. Although the document is quite detailed and is 34 pages in length, the certification process itself is actually very straightforward. Most questions about eligibility at the outset relate to the type of debt instrument that will be submitted for certification by the Climate Bonds Initiative. Here we can see Annex 1 on page 30, where we can see the bonds, loans, and other debt instruments which are currently eligible for certification. The list is here. And the other sections of the Climate Bond Standard document are pre-issuance requirements. So this is to certify debt that has not yet been issued. These are post-issuance requirements. This would be to certify debt that already has been issued. That can be either a follow-up verification report for previously certified debt, or it can be for certification of debt that was previously issued and not certified. We also call that retroactive certification. Part C has an overview of the eligibility of projects and assets. It also mentions the sector eligibility criteria. And Part D looks at the certification process under the Climate Bond Standard. Now let's look at step 3. And this might or might not be necessary to simply determine the eligibility of assets or uses of proceeds for certification. We've made available guidance documents on our website that can give you additional guidance on top of what we've provided in the sector criteria documents, the sector criteria background papers, and the Climate Bond Standard itself. So if you still had doubts, this would be the place to go to check out the guidance documents. Again, if you go to climatebonds.net, if you hover over certification and then scroll down to where it reads resources for issuers and verifiers, if you click on that, it brings up a web page that has the documents for additional guidance. And they are here. Documents for verifiers, we have our assurance framework, guidance for verifiers, and then checklists for pre-issuance certification and for post-issuance certification. If you have questions about the type of annual reporting that we require as a continual follow-up after certification during the term of the debt issuance, the document that we require filled out is here, Update Report Template, and you have the option of either filling this out and sending it to us annually to maintain certification, or if you include the information in this template in the current annual reporting you're doing, that's also acceptable. Here are links to web pages that we visited during this video. And if you're not a partner or issuer of certified climate bonds yet, we invite you to join our network. If you have questions or want to get in touch, please contact your Climate Bonds Initiative regional representative. If you don't have a regional representative or do not know who that is, you can simply send us an email at certification@climatebonds.net.